Penguin Readers, Level 3, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. My name is Jane Eyre, and my story begins when I was 10. I was living with my aunt, Mrs. Reed, because my mother and father were both dead. Mrs. Reed was rich. Her house was large and beautiful, but I was not happy. Mrs. Reed had 3 children, Eliza, Joan, and Georgiana. My cousins were older than I. They never wanted to play with me, and they were often unkind. I was afraid of them. I was most afraid of my cousin Joan. He enjoyed frightening me and making me feel unhappy. One afternoon, I hid from him in a small room. I had a book with a lot of pictures in it, and I felt quite happy. Joan and his sisters were with their mother, but then Joan decided to look for me. "Where is Jane Eyre?" he shouted. "Jane, Jane, come out." He couldn't find me at first. He was not quick or clever, but then Eliza, who was clever, found my hiding place. "Here she is," she shouted. I had to come out, and Joan was waiting for me. "What do you want?" I asked him. "I want you to come here," Joan said. I went and stood in front of him. He looked at me for a long time, and then suddenly he hit me. "Now go and stand near the door," he said. I was very frightened. I knew that Joan wanted to hurt me. I went and stood near the door. Then Joan picked up a large, heavy book and threw it straight at me. The book hit me on the head and I fell. "You cruel boy!" I shouted. "You always want to hurt me. Look, I touched my head." There was blood on it. John became angrier. He ran across the room and started to hit me again and again. I was hurt and afraid, so I hit him back. Mrs. Reed heard the noise and hurried into the room. She was very angry. She didn't seem to notice the blood on my head. "Jane Eyre, you bad girl," she shouted. "Why are you hitting your poor cousin? Take her away. Take her to the Red Room and lock the door." The Red Room was cold and dark. I was very frightened. Nobody ever went into the Red Room at night. I cried for help, but nobody came. "Please, help me," I called. "Don't leave me here." But nobody came to open the door. I cried for a long time, and then everything suddenly went black. I remember nothing after that. When at last I woke up, I was in my bed. My head was hurting. The doctor was there. "What happened?" I asked him. "You're ill, Jane," the doctor answered. "Tell me, Jane, are you unhappy here with your aunt and your cousins?" "Yes, I am," I answered. "I'm very unhappy." "I see," said the doctor. "Would you like to go away to school?" he asked. "Oh, yes, I think so," I told him. The doctor looked at me again, and then he left the room. He talked to Mrs. Reed for a long time. They decided to send me away to school. So, not long afterwards, I left my aunt's house to go to school. Mrs. Reed and my cousins were pleased when I went away. I wasn't really sad to leave. Perhaps I'll be happy at school, I thought. Perhaps I'll have some friends there. One night in January, after a long journey, I arrived at Lowood School. It was dark and the weather was cold, windy and rainy. The school was very large. but it wasn't warm and comfortable like Mrs. Reed's house. A teacher took me into a big room. It was full of girls. There were about 80 girls there. The youngest girl was 9, and the eldest were about 20. They all wore ugly brown dresses. It was supper time. There was water to drink and a small piece of bread to eat. I was thirsty and drank some water. I couldn't eat anything because I felt too tired and too excited. After supper, all girls went upstairs to bed. The teacher took me into a very long room. All girls slept in this room. 2 girls had to sleep in each bed. Early in the morning, I woke up. It was still dark outside, and the room was very cold. The girls washed themselves in cold water and put on their brown dresses. Then everybody went downstairs, and the early morning lessons began. At last, it was time for breakfast. I was now very hungry. We went into a dining room with the teachers. There was a terrible smell of burning food. We were all hungry, but when we tasted the food, we couldn't eat it. It tasted terrible. Feeling very hungry, we all left the dining room. At 9 o'clock, lessons began again. I looked around at the other girls. They looked very strange in their ugly brown dresses. I didn't like the teachers. They seemed to be unkind and unfriendly. Then at 12 o'clock, the head teacher, Miss Temple, came in. She was very pretty and her face was kind. "I want to speak to all the girls," she said. "I know that you couldn't eat your breakfast this morning," she told us. "So now you will have some bread and cheese and a cup of coffee." The other teachers looked surprised. "I'll pay for this meal," Miss Temple said. The girls were very pleased. After this meal, we went out into the garden. The girls' brown dresses were too thin for the cold winter weather. Most of the girls looked cold and unhappy, and some of them looked very ill. I walked around and looked at the girls at the school and the garden, but I didn't speak to anyone, and nobody spoke to me. One of the girls was reading a book. "Is your book interesting?" I asked her. "I like it," she answered. "Does this school belong to Miss Temple?" I asked. "No, it doesn't," she answered. "It belongs to Mr. Brocklehurst. He buys all our food and all our clothes." The girl's name was Helen Burns. She was older than I. I liked her immediately. She became my friend. Helen told me that many of the girls were ill because they were always cold and hungry. Mr. Brocklehurst was not kind. The clothes he bought for the girls were not warm enough for the winter, and there was never enough food to eat. After a few months, many of the girls at Lowood School became seriously ill. Lessons stopped, and I and the other girls who were not ill spent all our time out in the fields near the school. The weather was now warm and sunny. It was a happy time for us, but my friend Helen Burns wasn't with us. She had to stay in bed. She was very ill. One evening, I went to Miss Temple's room. Helen Burns was laying there in a little bed. She was now very thin, and her face was white. She spoke to me in a low voice. "Jane," she said, "it's good to see you. I want to say goodbye to you." "Why?" I asked her. Are you going away? Yes, I am, Helen answered. I'm going far away. That night, she died.